2,938 brave young men with an average age of 20 years old who rose in 1940 into uncertain skies to meet the threat of a Nazi invasion that could have changed the world. And Pip Cardell was one of them. He was one of the few. Now, I'm really fortunate to have researched and to looked into Pip's story, and it's a pleasure to bring it to you. He was a member of 603 Squadron, who were initially posted up in Scotland. So as the Battle of Britain raged, as Nazi forces steamrolled their way through Europe and were looking at Britain, and had planned Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned Nazi invasion of Great Britain. Pip Cardell was in Scotland with his squadron training. They were in the fortunate position of spending time together, training with each other and getting to know one another. The basic plan of Operation Sea Lion, of this invasion, was to clear the skies over Britain, and that would make way for the German forces to sail across the Channel. That's what they wanted to do. Fly over Britain, entice our fighters into the air, shoot them down so they can clear the skies and protect the invasion. Therefore, the only thing stopping Nazi Germany invading was these brave young men. Pip Cardell was up in Scotland with 603 Squadron as the battle raged down south. And as the intensity increased, the Battle of Britain started on July the 10th. The intensity increases into August the 18th, and known as the hardest day. There were huge losses on both sides. And then 2 days after that, the 20th of August, the 603 Squadron pulled down from Scotland and thrust into the heart of the Battle of Britain. They flew down and landed at Hornchurch. Now, they were an incredible squadron, incredibly brave, so they suffered huge losses. Young men became famous like Peter Pease, Richard Hillary, who wrote the famous book The Last Enemy, almost, who suffered terrible injuries. But they were very much on the front line. Pip was very much on the front line, doing his duty for his nation. And that brings us to the 27th of September 1940. Now, a huge scrap erupted over the Channel, and 603 flew there to meet this threat. It was against Messerschmitt 109, so the German equivalent fighter, and a huge scrap erupted over the Channel. Now, you can't tell Pip's story without telling the story of Flying Officer Peter Dexter, DFC. The two men are just intrinsically linked. Now, Peter Dexter flew into the scrap, latched onto the back of a Messerschmitt 109, but fell into the trap that the German fighters would use as a tactic, and a second plane cottoned onto his tail, and he was trapped between two aircraft, essentially stuck between two in a very adverse, a very serious position. That is until Pip Cardell saw what was happening and wheeled in his Spitfire, formed up with Dexter, and they managed to fight their way out of that situation, shoot both of the enemy aircraft down, and carry on the fight. They were then set upon by another 5 German 109s. So they were outnumbered and flew and fought to save their lives, twisting and turning under incredible pressure, with aircraft whizzing past them, seconds that would have seemed like minutes, that would have seemed like hours, just flying to survive. They eventually managed to get themselves out of that situation, and both aircraft headed back for Britain, headed back for the White Cliffs. But as Dexter looked across, he could see that Cardell was having issues. His aircraft was losing height, and at 300 feet, when they were a quarter of a mile off the coast, he could see Pip Cardell exit his aircraft. He jumped out, but there wasn't enough height, and his parachute didn't open, and Cardell fell into the Channel. Now, as Dexter looked down, incredibly, he could see that almost instantly Pip surfaced and he was alive. And it left Dexter in the position of, what does he do? How does he help his friend? So he began circling Cardell's position, frantically trying to raise awareness that hopefully a motor launch or someone can come from the coast and come and save him. They were a quarter of a mile from Folkestone, but it wasn't working. So he took the decision to leave his friend and fly off to Folkestone to try and get the help. Initially, he flew around the harbour, trying to pull people's attention out to where his friend was, but still no one realised what he was doing. So he took the incredibly brave decision to circle round once more and crash land his Spitfire on the beach of Folkestone. He commandeered a boat with the fishermen, and they made their way back out to find his friend. Now, half an hour had passed from when Pip fallen in the water They sighted someone on the horizon, but by the time they got to Pip Cardell, unfortunately it was too late. They pulled his body into the boat, and Dexter tried to resuscitate his friend the whole way back, but just couldn't do it. And it just shows what these young men were going through. These were brave young men. Pip was 23 years old, but as a collective they had an average age of 20. And they were doing this for us, for our freedom. They gave their today so we could have ours. And I'm immensely proud of that generation, of those pilots, of the 544 brave Britain pilots who laid down their life. And Pilot Officer Philip Pip, to me, Cardell was one of them. And that's why it's an immense pleasure and privilege to work with you guys and to be here today. Thank you. I'm afraid I need notes. Hello, I first became aware of Pip Cardell at the age of 11 when my mum suggested that I read The Last Enemy by Richard Hillary. The story of Pip's loss and his friends' desperate attempts to save him stuck with me for years that followed, and I resolved that I would try to find out the true story behind the narrative in the book. I already felt I knew Pip quite well from the wonderful descriptions in Richard Hillary's book, but I was fortunate to find a resident of Paxton who was able to put me in touch with Pip's brother, Ted, who was living in California in 1997. I thought it most fitting to tell Pip's story from his brother's perspective today, and I'll be quoting directly from his last letter to me. Ted gave me permission to obtain Pip's RAF records and his outstanding medals from the MOD, which you can see here, but sadly he stopped communicating shortly afterwards. It would appear that sadly Ted had passed away before he had the chance to come and meet me and for his family to receive his medals. So the documents and medals that are on display today will be presented to the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust later next year. So I'll read from his last letter to me, if you will bear with me. Philip was a born farmer. Philip was a born farmer, a natural, and I was the one longing for the skies. Before the Second World War, we both joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve and took flying lessons at Cambridge, 20 miles from the family farm here at Great Paxton, where we both were born. He was a year older than me, and I was a very social type. When war started, I'd only put in 50 hours flying, and he had 120. So he fell into a group that were rushed through into a course leading to a Spitfire. Both Philip and I had stars in our eyes, and we wanted to get into flying, as did most of the other pilots that were in training. We never took the possibility of death very seriously. I was called into training eventually, but soon my parents saw a chance to get at least one of their sons in a non-combative role. They got the support of a local politician who convinced the RAF that I would be much more useful working on the farm. One day Philip flew his Spitfire over the farm while I was ploughing the field, and I got very upset. There he was flying, my favourite occupation, while I was driving a tractor. It seemed all wrong. At rare times, Philip visited home and we heard about his escapades. Philip's squadron were used to attack German positions on the French coast, and one day he and others were returning from such a sortie. Philip's plane may have been damaged, we don't know, but he bailed out at a low altitude and never pulled the ripcord. As you know, Pilot Officer Dexter crash-landed on the beach, commandeered a boat and retrieved his body. Philip was brought back to us and buried in the churchyard next door. Our family grieved very deeply for many years. Thank you.
Wonderful to have Pip's medals here then.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us what medals they are?
This one is the 1939-1945 Star, which has the Battle of Britain clasp on it, which was only given to members of the few. This central one is the Aircrew Europe Star for people who took part in operations that were over Europe. And this was the General War Medal, which most of the combatants had. But that was the whole collection.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's very special to have Pip's medals here. Jeff? necessary connection as you with this house, but bring on the present. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jeff Hill. My wife Ursula is at the back there. We moved to this house about 23 years ago, and when we moved in, we purchased the house from a family by the name of Woolard. And at the time we moved in, we had no idea, no knowledge at all of the Cardell family and the very significant role they played in both the history of this house and in fact the village. We lived here for a number of years before we had either the money or the time to do anything to the house, and this area of the garden, which is, as you can see, probably much improved now, was somewhat overgrown for many years. And whilst we were aware that there was a family member buried in the churchyard who was killed in the war, we didn't really know of Pip Cardell. We didn't know his story. All we knew that there was a grave the other side of the fence that was as poorly looked after as maybe the garden that was adjacent to it. So Pip's grave, as many of you will have already have seen, consists of a sundial with a monument in the middle, and in fact Pip made that sundial, and it used to be, we are told, in the garden here at Manor Farmhouse. About 10 years or so ago, I became more interested in the history associated with the two Great Wars. I went across to France and Belgium to see some of the battlefields, to visit the grave of one of my relatives, and subsequently went back to look at the D-Day landing sites. And what struck me about those visits was the amazing dignity and reverence with which the graveyards were looked after by the War Commission, and quite rightly was very struck by how much effort went into remembering those people who gave so much for the freedoms that we now enjoy. And on my return, Ursula and I talked about this and were really quite taken by the fact that Pip's grave had for so long been in such a poor state of repair, and just felt that it wasn't right or proper that somebody who had been so brave should rest in a place which didn't represent, if you like, the contribution that they made. And we were fortunate enough to do some work here in the garden about 18 months, 2 years ago, and we spoke to Annette. I'd learned a lot more about Pip at that time from Graham James from the Historical Society locally, and these two individuals went to work and secured permission from both the church, the family, and in fact the War Graves Commission for us to be able to repair, renovate, improve Pip's grave. We had no intention of doing anything to it other than returning it to its former glory, and I'm pleased to say that those permissions were granted, and whilst we had the work conducted here, we were able to do that and return the grave to how it was when it was first put there and Pip was laid to rest. So we've been incredibly fortunate to not only be able to do that, but to learn about Pip and the story associated with his service and his very untimely death. And through that work and through the work that was done by the church last year to remember the fallen, I came across David. David came to the church because of his interest in Pip Cardell, and it was through our conversations that David spoke of his work on the Tally Ho project, the plaque that had been erected to remember Victor Eakins, who lives in St Neots, and it was David that suggested to me that it would be a nice idea that we had a blue plaque put onto the house, and I was very, very keen and very happy to have that done. It's in a very, very significant position, and for those who are interested afterwards, there is a laptop here which shows a picture of Pip and Ted stood in this very spot in their uniforms before they both went into service. So it's absolutely appropriate that it should be where it is. So huge thanks to David, to Graham, to Annette, and to all of you people here today to be here when we are going to be unveiling what we consider to be a very significant monument to such a brave individual. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Is it on? Is it off? It's okay.
You all right, Ursula?
It's fine. Our very special moment. I'm going to invite Air Commodore Neil Connell to unveil the plaque. to my right here, in memory of Kit. And when Neil has done that, I suggest we give a hearty round of applause. And then we have a little bit of a time of silence as we wait for the bell, one of our church bells, to be tolled 23 times. Neil, thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honour actually to be asked to do this. I live in the village. I was commander of number 54 Fighter Squadron, which was a Battle of Britain squadron. I'm now in the reserve. I'm a member of number 601, not quite 603, 601 City of London Squadron, which is also a Battle of Britain squadron. And this is an incredibly fitting way of remembering these people permanently. And it's a shame, I think, that there are not more blue plaques commemorating these across the country. Because we often forget that what these gentlemen did was they struck the first real blow against Hitler. This is the first defeat that he suffered. And the result of that, and a few other factors, but chiefly as a result of their efforts, Hitler cancelled his invasion plans, and thereby turning the course of the war. So these are very significant people, and we ought to remember them. And congratulations to David and everyone involved in putting this blue plaque on the wall. Now, is timing really important today? Do we know?
No.
In which case, without further ado, I'm assured nothing can go wrong. Unlike the late Duke of Edinburgh, I am not an expert at this, and I noticed there are several chords that I could pull. The white one, says Ursula from the back. Both of the white ones together? Certainly, without further ado. It's working. Is this from the same stable as the other blue plaques that we see around the UK?
Oh, sorry, Dave.
some special moments. Neil, Chelsea, all flight. Last second question.
So lastly, David, whether this blue plaque is one out of the stable of the other blue plaques we see around the country, or whether this is different and special?
Well, it's different and special because it comes from the heart. So it's not a British Heritage one, but the company that made it are the company that made them for Heritage. And it's Jeff who really was the force behind getting it done. We worked together. It was his house, his decision, so we're incredibly grateful. But in answer to your question, it is special because it's pit and it's from the heart. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay.
Thank you so much. Well, we've come towards the end of our times together. Oh, what a relief this worked. Some anxiety, it was just all off. Beautifully done, well done, everyone. Just make it possible. Is that your engineering? Yes. Well, no, clap for Jeff. Well done.
That bit was special. He's got the wrong lens.
That was a bit high, wasn't it? That was utterly miraculous. That's funny. We did wonder if that might happen, and it has. Isn't that incredible? Thank you so much, everyone. Don't rush off if you want to chat. And again, huge thank you to everyone who's made today possible. That was incredible. That boy, you won't forget that in a hurry. Take care, everyone. God bless you all. Thank you.
To all of you watching, Cardell family members and others, thank you so much for all your interest. God bless you all, keep you safe. I hope you feel we've made a very fitting memorial to Pitt. And that was a real Spitfire plane that flew across. Amazing. God bless you all.